Hello, welcome to the Waterfront Walking Tour, virtual version. My name is Lonna Callas and I'll be your guide. I'm a volunteer with the Waterfront Alliance in Gig Harbor, and together with the Harbor History Museum and Harbor Wild Watch, we are the three groups that put on free public walking tours. We've been doing it for 6 years, and this is our first virtual tour, so we're excited to have you. Now this that you're on right now is the Skiffs to Spirits tour, and I am not a historian. I am just an enthusiast. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comment section and we will do our best to answer them. Now, we are standing at Austin Estuary Park. Actually, let me correct that. I am standing here by myself. I don't know where you are, but this is one of 23 parks and open spaces in Gig Harbor City. This particular park is on the traditional lands of the American Native population called the Puyallups. Now, Puyallup is a Lashutsky language, and it means welcoming and very generous people. And the Puyallups lived here for thousands of years. That's why this is my favorite spot, because history hangs heavy right here. This has been inhabited for thousands of years. Now, if you look around, you see nature, and that's the reason this was such a popular spot. We have over here Donkey Creek, which is a freshwater stream. There are salmon in Donkey Creek. We have Gig Harbor, which is a saltwater harbor, and a natural tidal sway here. So we have fish, seals, octopus, shellfish, and we have the trees. Lots of forests around here. These are the natural resources that would be important to a Native American population. This was so important right here that the Puyallup, Squaxin, and Nisqually tribes, which were part of the greater Pacific Northwest Snohomish tribe, had a huge longhouse here, and they lived for centuries in peace. And so we honor them and their stewardship of this land. Now, in the 1800s, we didn't have a road here. We didn't have a Harbor History Museum here. We didn't have a creek. What we did have in this area in the late 1800s, that's where I'm taking you now, was a lumber mill. Charles Osgood Austin came here from New Hampshire in the late 1800s. This was after the Native Americans were taken off this land because of a treaty with the United States government. We had Charles Osgood Austin come here, and he developed a lumber mill. Now, when the natives left the area, we had a lot of European settlers come in. They were mostly Croatian and Scandinavian, and their names and net sheds and industry are all line this harbor even today. We have boats named after them, net sheds named after them. There's famous buildings here and piers named after these early settlers, and they are ancestors of descendants who are still here. This is a very historical place. Charles Austin, back to the lumber mill, had a lumber mill here for about 43 years. He employed about 30 people, and there was a huge need for lumber here because we had fishermen. This is a huge fishing area, and they needed boats. We have the wood, we have the fishermen, we need boat building, and we need a lumber mill. This was the major local lumber mill for all that time. There's a good story about Charles. He was a pillar of society, and he had a tragic death here at the mill. But it's another tour and another story. I want to bring your attention across the water, very close, to a place called Murphy's Landing. Murphy's Landing is where my story starts. Right now it is a huge marina. There's a lot of condos and a big parking lot. But that's not what it was like back in 1916. That's the year we're talking about. My story starts in 1916, when a majority of Washington voters, 94.7%, approved an amendment to the Washington Constitution to prohibit saloons in the state. Now you know where I'm going with this, because prohibition was 100 years ago. We had no saloons, no bars, no taverns. You could not buy a drink, but you could get 2 quarts of hard liquor or 12 quarts of beer every 20 days. But you had to go through the county auditor. And look, we have boats here. We don't have internet. We don't have a bridge. It was a little bit difficult. To make matters worse, a year and a half later, 1918 now, the lawmakers enacted another law. We call it the Bone Dry Law, which was reflected a year later in the U.S. Congressional Amendment of Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. Now, everyone is bone dry, including Gig Harbor. Now, Gig Harbor, if you wanted to have a social life or a party here, you had to have it at the church. So what happens? Now I'm looking at you, Murphy's Land. You remember over there? This is the den of iniquity for Gig Harbor, right here. Not far from Charles Austin's lumber mill, as a matter of fact. The Nowak brothers built the Silvery Glide saloon, dance hall, and roller rink, all in one, right there on the water, because frankly everything was on the water then. We got around in rowboats back then. One thing you have to remember about building something on the water, noise carries, especially late at night. So the goings on in the den of iniquity where liquor was being served were no big secret to Gig Harbor. And it culminated in an expose by the local newspaper. And I'm going to read you a small quote from there. It's March 31st, 1922, 100 years ago. The Bay Island News says, one of 2 things is going to happen in Gig Harbor in the not too distant future. Bootlegging, drunkenness, and their accompanying evils are going to be stopped in a lawful and orderly manner. An explosion of resentment is due from our people. It will be well for county officials, bootleggers, and drunks to take notice and govern themselves accordingly. Conditions in Gig Harbor last Saturday night and the Sunday morning following were as worse as any of the worst orgies, I'm getting excited here, happened in the worst mining camps of early days. Now you have to remember, they said, things better change, enough said, end of quote. Well, this is quite a threat from the community around here. And you have to remember the noise is carrying, and things are happening in this den of iniquity. Not only roller skating while drinking, which I can't even imagine, but illicit activities are going on. It was shortly shut down, alas. Because, you know, girls' reputations were at stake. Things had to happen. Well, they did move the party over to Horseshoe Lake in 1925, but you know, that's another story. And it's not the end of the Silvery Glide. Even though it was dismantled, the lumber from the Silvery Glide dance hall and roller rink was used to build the Gillich net shed, which is just right around the corner here. And the Gillich net shed is now the Moeller Blair net shed. It is being used by present-day fishing families as a real commercial net shed with purse seine boats outside of it. Now, if you have a chance to go into a net shed, and more on that later at a different stop, history will hang heavily as you walk into that net shed because nets are hanging down. Now, this concludes our story, but if you are going to be in Gig Harbor, please look at some of the stops on this tour because they will carbonate your experience. So friends and family, if you come to Gig Harbor, so much history is here. We're so proud of our history. We are tied to it, to our history by the water. And it's all along here. Now, to quote the Island Bay News, enough said.